Hey, and welcome to the fifth tutorial in the series of tutorials that will teach you how to create a SlopeBlend effect in CryEngine. So, some eagle-eyed people out there probably noticed that I think, 2 tutorials ago, I was defining the texture slots for the SlopeBlend, so the diffuse, the normal, the height. And I had accidentally forgotten to change the register number, T10 to T11, which was causing some problems. So you need to close the editor. If you're following this along straight up and you made the same mistake I did, then you just need to restart the editor and rename this to T11, and everything up to that point will work just as it does right now for me. So I have the blend texture in the height slot here, and that's what you're seeing here. Just coming out of the last tutorial, you will have just set up this particular element of this effect. So from here, we're going to move on. We need to create a function that will allow us to control the contrast of the mask. So let's do that now. So we need to define some new things. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm just going to duplicate this mask strength. Okay, and we're going to call this mask contrast, only not spelled contrast. And we're going to change this regpm param to our 9.x because 8 x, y, and z are used, x, y, z, and w. So 9.x. We're going to call this mask contrast. I'm just going to leave these default, and I'm going to put the mask contrast on there, default to 1. Now, I changed the default numbers for threshold deviation to 1 each because they give a good result by default. You will need to kind of tweak and find out what numbers seem to look good on the most assets, and then just set these defaults here, the default amount, to whatever looks generally the best. That way the artist has something to look at that works from the beginning. So I'm going to add one more parameter, and I'm going to call it, I'm actually going to add a UV parameter. So we're going to call this one slope UVs. And let's just add the Y to that. SlopeBlend UV scale. Let's just do that. Alright, and then the max value for this can be like 100. Defaulting to 1. The reg parameters look good, so I'm saving. We can now load the editor. And there's an optimization here that we can do. In the previous tutorial, we just tested the UVs using the tester function that we put in there from the beginning. We're actually going to set up a better UV handling system using the new UV parameter we just created. So right now, the SlopeBlend tester parameters, which controlling the UVs of the blend mask, we don't want that. Notice that our mask contrast parameter here and our UV scale parameter here are both working, and they're in the editor. So let's go to our code, and we're actually going to construct first. We're going to construct a float 2, and we're going to call this, let's call this slope UVs final. All right. And we're going to say this is equal to in.basetc.xy times our slope UVs parameter. Okay, and let's put this slope UVs final in place of our in.basetc.xy. Now the reason we want to do this is because if we actually multiplied in each one of these, then we're doing 3 multiplications instead of just 1. So performance-wise, you want to avoid any math operations that you don't absolutely have to use. Also, it makes things a little cleaner. That way you only have to change one thing. Say you wanted to, I don't know, change the UVs with something else. Then all you have to do is include one line instead of having to duplicate over to many lines. So it's a maintenance thing, and it's cleaner, and it's runs better. There's no downside at all. So I'm just going to define this as handle UVs. Okay, now we got to get into making another function. We're going to need to create a contrast function, and we're going to use Photoshop math for this. I will put a link in the description to the Photoshop blend modes math. Very useful. Not all of it translates to HLSL very well, and nor should you do it this way for the most part, but contrast is a kind of a specific case where it's pretty cheap to do this way. So we're going to take an in map and into our function that we will then use this function on to create a contrast control. So we want to go ahead and return the in map, and we want it to equal. Here, let's go ahead and define our interior one already. So this is in map minus 0.5 times the max of our, I believe it was mask contrast, yep, of this value here from our ilm.cfx file. Okay, and then 0. So max, we're going to get the max value of this after it's been multiplied by inmap minus 0.5. So we're getting our median value, basically. And then we're getting the maximum value of that. Next, we are going to... do I have this lined up? Yes, okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add on top of that 0.5 again. Okay. I won't claim to understand exactly why we do that, but if you change this, then you only get kind of one part of the contrast. So I'm guessing that we're getting the values above 0.5 and the values below 0.5. And then we're getting the maximum of that to get the contrast value. Okay, I believe that is correct. Let's just take a last look at this real quick. Let me make sure my brackets are all correct. Yep, looks correct to me. Okay. Ooh, actually, no, that's right. Okay, man, sometimes that gets confusing. Okay, now we're going to use that cheap contrast function, and we're going to put it on our slope mask times equals slope height by mask strength. If you recall, this mask strength value is what we're using to define the power of the mask applied. But we also want to be able to control the kind of slope of that mask in and of itself, but we want to be able to do that somewhat cheaply. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign a cheap contrast. So we're going to make this function inside of there, and then we're going to put our mask contrast parameter in there. So now this will evaluate, and then the times strength will evaluate, and this will give us control over that. Assuming I haven't made any grave errors. Of course I did. Cheap contrast, no matching to parameter function. Wait, did I pass? Oh, right. Shoot, I forgot. I don't need to. That's habit from previous versions of the engine. You only need to actually have your slope height in there. So the actual mask contrast parameter is doesn't need to be passed into the functions anymore. Okay, so let's save that. Cool. All right, let's take a look. Our mask contrast should now, yep, it now controls the contrast of that particular mask, so we get more or less of that effect that we're looking for. And our UV scale should control the scale of the UV tiling for the blend layer. Notice how it's not affecting our anything else. It's just affecting our slope layer. Okay, so we have corrected a texture mistake, a texture loading mistake for our slot. We have added functionality to our mask so that we can control its strength and its contrast separately. And we have kind of tweaked our default values. So the default values, whenever you enable SlopeBlend, are are better for whatever other assets there may be. For instance, if I go over here for these guys and I turn on SlopeBlend, we should get a better default result than we did before. So it's also important to note that with this effect, the SlopeBlend effect, if you're making assets like this, they should all be in the same master material, and each asset should be a submaterial, because then you can instance all those textures across all those materials, and you only have to load the texture once. So that's really important from optimization. In the next tutorial, I will be covering the fun part, which is the diffuse, the normals, and maybe even the height blending if you want to use, say, offset bump mapping or parallax occlusion mapping with this. That's a whole other complicated subject, and that will be kind of covered much later. So I hope you are following along well. There's some mistakes that I made that I had to go back and correct, which is fine as long as I'm making it clear what is the problem, what isn't. Hopefully we can come up with a pretty cool effect by the end and start adding small features to it, and I can show ways to optimize layers and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed. I will join you in the next one.